Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So we have a unique one here for you today. This is the Super Console X Stick Pro. And boy, that's quite a mouthful, but at the end of the day, this really is supposed to be exactly like the Super Console X Pro, but with 2 gigabytes of RAM, and then in a smaller form factor as you see here. So in today's video, we're just going to pick this thing apart. We're going to see all the good with it, all the bad, and help you make a decision on whether or not this is something you want to add to your library. As you may know from my previous videos, I'm a pretty big fan of the Super Console X and the Super Console X Pro. So let's see how this one stacks up. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, right off the bat, let's start with some stats. So this uses the S905X chipset, which is the same one that's found on the Super Console X Pro. And this CPU is just a little bit faster than the one on the original Super Console X, but honestly, the difference between the two is barely discernible. Now the thing that sets this one apart is that it's the first Super Console X device to have 2 gigs of RAM. All the others have come with only 1 gig of RAM. And that low amount of RAM has prevented some performance gains. So we'll take a look at that later. This one comes bundled with the same EmuELEC 3.9 software that comes with the Super Console X Pro, as well as the same Android 7.1.2. So let's actually unbox this thing and let me show you all this stuff. Okay, so first thing I want to say here is that I did not expect the box to be this big. I thought because it was a little Fire Stick kind of thing that it would be a much smaller box, but I forgot about the 2 controllers that come with the device. But yeah, this is what the box looks like. Pretty basic. One thing I did notice that was different is that it says Bluetooth on it. That's the only box I've seen that says Bluetooth. So we'll check that out later. Inside, you'll find an HDMI extender in case you can't plug the stick directly into your TV. And then here you go, here's the stick itself. It does seem very small. You can see here's the SD card. It just comes with a generic 64 gig SD card and a micro USB for charging, and then 2 USB ports, and that's it. The controllers are the same ones you'll find in any of these Super Console X's. They're just like these knockoff PS2 controllers, and they need their own batteries. Underneath, you can see it has a power brick, a micro USB cable, a new upgraded remote that uses 2.4 gigahertz wireless, and the USB hub. There's also a manual inside, but I think we're going to be able to figure it out ourselves. Okay, so opening it up is very easy. All you have to do is slip the case off. Now some of this is kind of hard to discern, but the chip that has the wire coming out of it, that's the Wi-Fi antenna. And then that big black rectangle in the center, that's a heatsink that's covering the chipset as well as the 2 RAM chips. But unfortunately all that's hidden, so I can't really verify that this is actually 2 gigabytes of RAM, but there's a way to do that in software, so we'll check that out later. Okay, so quick size comparison between the Console X and the Console X Pro. Obviously, this stick has a much smaller form factor, and I do like how sleek and modern it looks. You know, the 2 Super Console X's just look very cheap and shoddy. But you know, one thing that these older models have that I really appreciate is an Ethernet port. And you could essentially use a USB port to use a USB Ethernet dongle, but that's just another thing you're going to have to buy in order to have the same functionality in these previous models. Alright, so let's plug it in and see whether or not those 2 gigabytes are going to make a difference when it comes to performance. So just booting it right in, it's going to come up with Emulation Station, and this is the initial interface you're going to see here. Now personally, I'm not a very big fan of this theme, so let's go ahead and change it. First thing you'll have to do is go into the network settings, and then add your own Wi-Fi address and your Wi-Fi password. And like I mentioned earlier, you could also use a USB Ethernet port. So then go into Updates and Downloads, Themes Downloader, and then pick whatever theme you want to use. I like to use one called ELEC Full EmuELEC. This is what it looks like here. I think it looks really good on TVs. So first thing I'm noticing is that the interface feels a little bit zippier, and maybe that's because of the extra RAM. Either way, I'm just going to cycle through all the systems here so you can see all the things that are included on the stock SD card when you first buy it. So this has the same strength as the other Super Console X devices in that this is a very plug-and-play friendly device. You basically just have to buy it, plug it into your TV, and you can start playing games immediately. It comes with the controllers you need, it comes with all the games already loaded on it, everything's easy. And that's the major strength of these devices. But there are some tweaks you can do, and let me show you a few of those now. So for example, let's start up Super Mario Bros. 3. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that the screen is a little bit fuzzy looking. It's a little bit blurred around the edges, and that's because bilinear filtering is on. So that's an easy fix. We're going to go back into the emulation station menu, go into game settings, and then under smooth games, we're going to change it from auto to off. This is going to give us sharper pixels. Also, while we're in here, let's go into EmuELEC settings and turn off the always show boot video. This will make it so you don't have to see the video every single time you start up the device. It'll save you some time. Okay, so booting back into Mario Bros. 3 here, you can see that everything is much sharper and clearer. Now personally, you might like that fuzziness, so you can keep that on, but personally, I like to have these sharper, clearer pixels. But you know, this extra 2 GB of RAM is going to make no difference when it comes to playing NES games or things like that. So overall, I would just say the gameplay is as expected. It works just fine. Moving up to higher end systems, here's the PlayStation 1. Now the Super Console X devices actually do PS1 really well, and so what I recommend is go into the options and then set it to a higher resolution. And 3D games like Crash Bandicoot run really well like this. Now moving over to Nintendo 64, I'm running at a 320 by 240, so a lower end resolution here. But the gameplay is nice and smooth. You can see it's a smooth 60 frames per second. And that's fine, but personally I like to have my games look as good as possible. So let's bump it up to 640 by 480, so it's a 480p display. And you can see you do have a bit of a cut in frame rates, going down to about 54, 55, 56 frames per second. And this is going to be your choice, whether or not you think that this is a compromise worth making. Personally, I think it's worth it. Now other systems like Nintendo DS, they work just fine. In general, your biggest limitation with DS is whether or not it's going to be a game that requires touchscreen controls. But overall, DS is one of my favorite systems to play on these TV devices. Now all these games are preloaded on the device. I haven't added any games to my device at this point. But at the same time, they've kind of cherry-picked which games are on this console. So for example, when it comes to Dreamcast, they've mostly only put on games that are easy to run. So Sonic Adventure 2, like this one, it runs just fine. But other games on the Dreamcast may have issues. We'll get into that later. And this whole cherry picking of games happens across all of the higher end systems. So you can see here with PSP, only a few PSP games are on here, and they're all the ones that run just fine on this system. And if you have any questions about how games work on the Super Console X, I would encourage you to watch my other 2 videos where I go into a little bit more detail about how games perform on those systems, because it's going to be the same performance on this one too. Okay, so let's go ahead and shut down the system here. We're going to take the SD card out and we're going to boot into the Android side of things. And all you have to do in order to get to the Android side is just remove the SD card. Super easy. And this is what the Android side looks like on the Super Console X stick. As you can see, Netflix and YouTube are front and center here in the interface, but there are other things you can do. So I'm going to jump into Google Play here. I'm going to sign into my account. And then we can start downloading apps and games and things like that. So if you see anything that tickles your fancy, for example, this game here, which I've never heard of, but it's called Raid Shadow Legends. If this is something you wanted to play, go ahead and do it. I've heard this one really sucks, so maybe don't do it. But one tool that is going to be helpful is called Ada64. Let's install that one now. This is going to allow us to see what's inside the device itself. So jumping into this app, you can see here that indeed it does have 2 GB of installed RAM. You can also see that it has 10 GB of internal storage to run Android, and it does say that it has Bluetooth 4+ here. But the thing is, when I try to connect to a Bluetooth accessory, both on the Android and on the EmuELEC side, it doesn't pick up anything. So I'm not really sure if Bluetooth works on this device. Now when it comes down to it, the 2 GB of RAM is really helpful when it comes to playing Android games. You can see here with Horizon Chase, it's running very smoothly. Everything looks really nice on this. So if you like Android games, this is going to be better than on the Super Console X Pro. Additionally, streaming seems to work better on this one than it does on the other 2 devices. So if you have a PC that's loaded up with games or emulators and things like that, you can connect to it through this device and then play all your games from your PC on your home TV. And I should mention here that I am connected via a USB Ethernet cable, which is probably improving my streaming performance. But yeah, overall, no complaints when it comes to streaming on this device. It's definitely better than it was on the Super Console X Pro. So yeah, overall, Android is just fine on this device. I think the 2 GB does help, but if you're really looking for a nice Android experience, this may not be the device for you. This isn't a dedicated Android box. There are Android boxes out there that are much cheaper than this, half the price really. So something to bear in mind, if you really do want to play Android, maybe the Super Console X stick here isn't your best choice. Now, one issue I found is that when I tried to boot into EmuELEC after running the Android side, everything was messed up. The visuals were messed up and everything else like that. So I found the fix for it. You have to go into here into Droid settings, then go into display, and then set the screen resolution to 1080p. Because I'm running on a 4K monitor right now, it defaulted to 4K, but when I went into Emulation Station, it hosed everything up. So it's much better to change it here in the Android settings, and then when you boot back into EmuELEC, everything will be fine. Now, I didn't talk a lot about this remote here that comes with the device, and that's mostly because I don't think the remote should be part of your buying decision when it comes down to it. But this remote, it seems fine. It uses a USB dongle in order to connect, and it is probably one of the best remotes I've seen for any of these devices. Okay, so another thing you could do, because you have 2 GB of RAM to work with, is you could load up EmuELEC 4.0 or higher onto this device. And EmuELEC 4.0 runs on 64-bit, and because of that, it requires more RAM, so this is a perfect fit here. And initially I thought, hey, I'll do an install video to show you how to install EmuELEC 4.0, but honestly my friend EmuChicken over at Team Pandori has already done a really good video on that, and that would extend this video by another 10 minutes if I did it anyway. So I'm just going to encourage you to go over to Team Pandori's page and check out their EmuELEC 4.0 install guide video. It's super handy, it's only 9 minutes long. Okay, so here we are in EmuELEC 4.0, and I'm using that same theme here, so it doesn't look like a lot has changed, but some things have changed under the hood. So for example, if you go into the ports folder, there now are additional ports that weren't available in the other EmuELECs. And my favorite of those are the Sonic ports. These are widescreen ports of the original Sonic games. And I've already made a dedicated video on how to set up these Sonic ports, but overall, if you really love Sonic, this is a pretty cool experience. So now let's talk about emulation performance, in particular with EmuELEC 4.0 using this 2 GB of RAM on this device. Right off the bat, I saw no difference when it came to Nintendo DS. Everything ran just as good as it did before. Same thing with PlayStation 1, I didn't see any changes in performance here. But honestly, PlayStation 1 already ran really well. And let me just pause and take a second to acknowledge how ridiculous the 2 costumes on these characters are in Tekken 3. Like, is King wearing Skechers right there? Like, it's ridiculous. I never really noticed how 90s this game was until this very moment. Okay, getting back on topic, let's talk about arcade for a second. If you look up in the top right of the screen here, you can see my memory usage. And you can see that it never gets close to 2 GB. So what I'm learning here is that yes, even though EmuELEC 4.0 has higher RAM requirements, it's still getting nowhere near that cap, which means that the RAM isn't going to be the limiting factor in this device. The actual limiting factor when it comes to emulation is going to be the system on the chip. So what that means in plain terms is that Killer Instinct and other harder to play games are still not going to play on this device. They're not limited by RAM, they're limited by the CPU. Same thing with Nintendo 64. There are some games that are just going to play well in 640 by 480 resolution. For example, both of the cruising games are going to play just fine. But as before, F-Zero is going to have a performance hit if you want to play in 640 by 480 resolution. And then some games like Mario Tennis are just crawling, but as you can see, the memory has nothing to do with it. In the top right, you can see that only 550 or so megabytes of the RAM are actually being used. So yeah, going back to the drawing board here, EmuELEC 4.0 does Sonic Adventure 2 just fine, just like it did on EmuELEC 3.9. But if you get into the harder to emulate games like Virtua Tennis 2, there's definitely some slowdown. Soul Calibur 2 also plays well, it just has some graphical glitches because of the Flycast core. But then if you jump into something like Dead or Alive 2, you can definitely feel the performance hits here. I would say the ceiling that we're hitting here is the clock speed of that 1.5 GHz CPU. So if you're expecting that 2 GB of RAM is going to improve performance across the board for you, I'm here to say that when it comes to these harder to emulate systems, you're hardly going to see any, if any, performance improvements. When it comes down to it, PSP performance was about what I expected. I'm playing it at 1x resolution here, and the performance it's just okay. I have an auto frame skip of 1 on here, and it does get a little bit jerky as you're playing. But unfortunately, because you're using a 1x resolution here, the graphics just aren't that great because they don't look so good when they're blown up on a big TV like this. I think they'd look really nice if you had a 2x resolution to work with, but unfortunately the system just can't handle it. So unfortunately, you're going to have some low-res gameplay when you're playing PSP on a TV like this. And just to confirm here, this isn't going to unlock gameplay for Sega Saturn or things like that. Here's Panasonic 3DO, as you can see here, it's still playing very slowly. I would say overall it's playing at about 75% speed, which unfortunately is very tangible when you're playing a game. And games like Need for Speed play at maybe about half speed. Overall, you're not going to have fun playing 3DO or Sega Saturn on this device. Okay, so starting to wrap up here, usually at this point I like to do a likes and a dislikes section, but I've already done that for the other two Super Console X devices, so I don't think it's warranted here. Instead, I just want to kind of compile the three of them together and talk about whether or not they're worth it to you in the context of one another. So let's start with talking about the Super Console X here. Now what I really like about this device is that it's very plug and play and there's no fuss involved. If you just want to buy a device for $70, plug it into your TV, you've got 10,000 games to play right then and there. And I think that's a very powerful tool for people who don't want to mess around with emulation. Now the Super Console X Pro is basically identical to that, other than it has a slightly upgraded chipset and then it also boots into a usable version of Android. The problem with the Android side of things is that it's limited by the RAM. So yes, you can play Android games, yes you can stream, but it's not a very good experience because of that 1 GB of RAM. This one also costs about $70 online. Now the Super Console X Pro stick is kind of best and worst of both of those worlds. It has that same plug and play and no fuss experience, and it has those Android features which are enhanced by that 2 GB of RAM. And because this has those 2 GB of RAM, you could upgrade this to EmuELEC 4.0 and beyond, but at that point you're going to be limited by the chipset, and the performance in reality is not going to be that great. And on top of that, in order to set up EmuELEC 4.0, you're going to have to move over your games, move over your BIOS files, add your own games, build your own game library. You're doing all the things you would have to do on any other device. It's all the fuss that you're trying to avoid with the Super Console X itself. And at that point, if you're willing to do all the fuss to make it work, then this isn't going to be the device for you because this one costs $90. It's at least $20 more expensive than the other two devices, and then you're going to have to do all that fuss anyway. And if you're going to end up doing all that fuss anyway, then I would recommend getting an Android TV box because it's going to be much more powerful than this device. Yeah, you're going to have to do some work to get it going, but you're going to save money and have better performance too. So long story short, the only people I think who are really going to be interested in this device are people who really like a small form factor or who want to have a better Android experience on their Super Console X stick. At the end of the day, these are the two main strengths that put this device over the other two. But in all other respects, like the plug and play functionality of the Super Console X, I think you should just go for the cheaper ones. And I'll leave links to AliExpress to all three of these down below so that you can browse and shop on your own and make a decision of whether or not any of these are going to be worth your time. But when it comes down to it, I think this Super Console X Stick Pro is a lot of power with no purpose. I think this company would have done a better service to everybody if they had put a better chipset in here instead of just the 2 GB of RAM. I was hoping it would improve performance by a lot, but as you saw in this video, it really didn't change much at all. And they charge you an additional $20 for that experience. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming!